Almost everything you were taught about the Wild West is wrong. Not slightly wrong, completely, deliberately, Hollywood manufactured wrong. The real frontier had no heroes in white hats, no noble outlaws robbing from the rich, and no lone cowboys riding free across land they actually owned. It had low-wage laborers, imported weeds, morphine sold to babies, and a government systematically destroying entire nations to clear the way for a railroad. Stick around, because the version nobody taught you is far more interesting than the one they did. 1. It makes sense when you think about it. Good guys wear white. Bad guys wear black. Simple, clean, and easy to follow, especially in a world where split-second decisions meant life or death. Of course, frontiermen would have settled on some kind of visual code. Of course it would have stuck. The idea feels so naturally true that questioning it never really seems worth the effort, which is exactly why it went unquestioned for so long. The white hat hero and black hat villain were invented by Hollywood screenwriters in the 1920s, specifically to help silent film audiences tell characters apart in fast-moving scenes with no dialogue to lean on. Before that, cowboys and outlaws picked their hats based on cost, availability, and personal preference. Black hats were actually common among working cowboys because they hid dirt well. White hats were considered impractical. On a cattle drive, where dust was a permanent condition, a white hat stayed clean for about an hour. The color coding had nothing to do with morality and everything to do with one industry's need to tell stories to audiences who could not yet hear them speak. It was never a frontier tradition. It was a costume department solving a storytelling problem, and somewhere along the way, everyone forgot that is where it started. 2. Jesse James survives in American memory the way dangerous men often do, cleaned up, sharpened into a symbol, and handed a motive noble enough to make the violence easier to swallow. In the legend, he is not just a robber, he is a frontier Robin Hood, taking from the powerful and delivering justice with a revolver. That version has one significant problem. Historians have gone through the records and found no credible evidence that Jesse James ever gave a single dollar to anyone in need. He and his gang robbed banks and trains, killed people who got in the way, and kept everything they took. The Robin Hood image was deliberately constructed, partly by sympathetic newspaper editors who framed him as a Confederate folk hero in the years following the Civil War, and partly by James himself, who understood that a well-managed legend offered more protection than the truth ever could. He was not feeding the poor, he was controlling his public narrative, the same way a modern me-celebrity manages a scandal, just with more gunfire and fewer publicists. That is the part worth sitting with. People did not forgive him because he was generous. They forgave him because someone handed them a story that made ruthless self-interest look like righteous rebellion. Jesse James did not steal for the poor, he stole for himself, and left the legend to handle the rest. 3. The Wild West most people grew up with came with one conflict already baked in. Cowboys on one side, Native Americans on the other, locked in some endless frontier war. The image repeated itself across so many films and TV shows that nobody stopped to ask who was actually doing the fighting and who was just being used as background for a myth that needed an enemy. Real cowboy life was far less dramatic. Most cowboys were working ranch hands with cattle to move and wages to earn. Their days were consumed by livestock, weather, difficult trail conditions, and the kind of physical exhaustion that leaves no room for battlefield glory. Large-scale violence against Native American communities was carried out primarily by the United States Army under direct government orders to clear land for expansion, settlement, and the railroads cutting westward. It was a deliberate military campaign, not a spontaneous showdown between cowboys and tribes playing out across open plains. The two worlds did cross paths, sometimes peacefully, sometimes not, but regular violent conflict between ranch hands and native nations was never the historical norm. The legend needed cowboys to look like soldiers. History never asked them to be. 4. Picture dragging yourself into a frontier town, half sick and fully exhausted, a cough settling into your chest, a tooth screaming for attention, and no real doctor anywhere in sight. The good news was that somebody always had something. The bad news was that something might be cocaine, opium, morphine, or heroin, poured into a bottle with a cheerful label and an encouraging name. This was medicine before regulation existed to question it. Patent remedies in the Old West promised relief for nearly everything: pain, anxiety, sleeplessness, troubled stomachs, and restless infants. Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, marketed directly for babies, relied heavily on morphine. It quieted more than just crying, and because meaningful oversight was essentially non-existent, anyone could walk in and purchase these mixtures over the counter like picking up soap or hard candy. That is the detail that dismantles the wholesome frontier pharmacy image. Much of what got sold as medicine was less about treating illness and more about sedation, managing dependency, or keeping a customer functional just long enough to need another bottle. The label promised relief. The chemistry delivered something far harder to put down. The frontier did not just sell cures, it sold addiction in glass bottles, dressed it up in soft language, and called the whole thing care. 5 Deadwood, 1876. A poker table. A man with his back to the door, which was unusual for him. One shot from behind, and it was over before he could process what happened. That should have been the whole story. It wasn't. Somewhere between the saloon floor and collective memory, a detail got added. The version most people know says Hickok died holding aces and eights, the dead man's hand. It fits so cleanly into the moment that it feels designed, because it probably was. Historians have gone back through the accounts, and that specific detail does not hold up consistently. The most repeated part of the story may simply be the part someone invented because the truth felt incomplete. And that is the more interesting thing here. The killing itself was not enough. People needed it decorated. They wanted an omen sitting on the table, a symbol that made the whole scene feel like it was building towards something. So that is what the story became. Facts get remembered. Symbols get repeated. Wild Bill died like men die. Suddenly, randomly, without warning. The legend just could not leave it that unglamorous. 6. There is a version of the Wild West that Hollywood has been selling for about a century. Dusty streets permanently one wrong word away from a body dropping. Saloons where the furniture exists mainly to be broken. Towns where the sunrise apparently comes with a body count. Watch enough of it, and you start to believe that frontier life was basically one long action sequence with occasional breaks for whiskey. Here is what that version leaves out entirely. Most frontier towns were boring, deliberately, stubbornly, thankfully boring. The people who built them wanted the same things people have always wanted: functioning businesses, reliable trade, a night of sleep without something catching fire. Gunfights were not entertainment. They were expensive, destabilizing, and had a tendency to end with someone dead, which was bad for commerce and worse for the person in question. Many towns had strict weapons ordinances. Some were safer than the cities back east. In plenty of places, a single shooting became a story that got repeated for a generation precisely because nothing remotely like it had happened since. The myth won anyway. That is the thing about dramatic stories. One gunfight at high noon does more lasting damage to historical memory than 1,000 quiet Tuesdays of people hauling supplies and paying their tabs. The extraordinary moment erases the ordinary years surrounding it. The real Wild West ran on hard labor, bad weather, loneliness, and people quietly trying to get through the week in one piece. The legend just had better cinematography. 7. The Wild West that most people inherited had a very specific role written for women. Stand in the background, look worried, wait to be rescued, maybe pour a drink. The story belonged to men with guns and horses, and women existed mostly to give those men something to ride back to. That version is not just incomplete, it is embarrassingly wrong. Frontier women were filing land claims independently, and historians estimate they represented nearly a third of all Homestead Act filings. That is not background character, behavior. Mary Fields stood 6 feet tall, smoked cigars, and became the first African-American woman to carry U.S. mail, running routes through brutal Montana winters that regularly defeated men decades younger than her. Annie Oakley could outshoot almost anyone alive and proved it repeatedly, including in front of European royalty. Charlotte Parkhurst spent years driving stagecoaches disguised as a man and quietly became one of the first women to cast a vote in an American election, decades before women's suffrage, was even a serious national conversation. These were not exceptions that slipped through the cracks of a male world. They were part of a much larger reality that the legends simply chose not to film. The frontier was a hard, wide, unforgiving place where survival mattered more than gender roles, and women carved out space the same way everyone else did, through stubbornness, skill, and refusing to wait for permission. The West never erased women. Hollywood just never figured out how to make their stories sell popcorn. 8. Picture it. A man crouches beside a cold California stream, swirls his pan slowly, and watches something catch the light. Gold. Right there in his hands. One moment, one discovery, and everything changes. That is the image America kept. The lone prospector, the four with a Sam pura cry, glittering pan, the life transformed overnight by nothing more than courage and a willingness to show up. It is a wonderful story. It just leaves out what happened to almost everyone who actually lived it. By the time most 49ers reached California, the easily accessible surface gold was already gone. The men who arrived early and got lucky were already gone too, or already rich and not sharing. What the rest found waiting for them was back-breaking labor, rapidly shrinking odds, and a local economy specifically designed to extract money from people too deep in the dream to walk away. They kept digging because the story of sudden wealth is a remarkably difficult thing to argue with when you have already crossed a continent to believe it. The steadier fortunes were never in the ground, they were behind the counter. Merchants selling shovels, boots, flour, and overpriced lodging to exhausted men made consistent money while the prospectors gambled everything on the next pan, the next dig, the next week. Levi Strauss did not get rich finding gold. He got rich selling durable trousers to men who were. America remembers the man who struck it rich because he makes a cleaner symbol than the thousands who went broke chasing the same fantasy. Most prospectors did not find treasure. They funded the people smart enough not to look for it. 9. You already know exactly how it sounds. The piano keeps playing while a chair sails across the room. A bottle shatters. Someone slides the full length of a table and somehow lands on their feet. Within seconds, half the saloon is involved, for reasons nobody stops to question, and the whole thing unfolds like it was rehearsed, which of course it was. That scene has appeared in so many westerns that it started feeling like historical documentation. It was never that. Saloons were businesses. That one fact quietly dismantles most of the fantasy. The owner behind that bar had money tied up in every chair, every bottle, every fixture in that room. A full brawl was not entertainment. It was inventory destruction. It was customers fleeing. It was a repair bill arriving before the dust had settled. Most saloon owners wanted trouble handled quickly and quietly, because chaos was expensive and a frightened crowd does not stick around to keep drinking. Fights did happen. Put alcohol, gambling, wounded pride, and tired men in the same room long enough, and something is going to ignite. But real saloon fights were typically fast, ugly, and contained. Two men with a specific problem, not 20 strangers cheerfully destroying the furniture while waiting their turn. The difference between history and Hollywood comes down to scale. One sudden, messy altercation is accurate. An entire room erupting in synchronized chaos while the piano somehow survives is a director solving a boredom problem. The frontier had bar fights. Hollywood turned them into a spectator sport with better lighting. 10. Hollywood built an image so clean it became impossible to question. A cowboy and his horse moving across open land at dusk, answering to nobody, owning everything he needed, and needing very little else. Free in the way that only men in myths ever really are. It was independence turned into a silhouette, and America framed it and hung it on the wall. The actual cowboy was having a considerably different experience. Most working cowboys owned almost nothing they used on the job. The horse belonged to the ranch. The saddle belonged to the ranch. In many cases, the gun on their hip belonged to the ranch too. These men were low-wage agricultural laborers doing physically punishing work for sometimes as little as $1 a day, frequently in debt to the company store, and entirely dependent on their employer for the basic tools that made the job possible at all. They could not quit easily. They could not take the horse when they left. They were, in almost every practical sense, the gig workers of the 19th century, just with worse weather, no benefits, and absolutely no way to log off. The fiercely independent frontiersman riding into the sunset on his own terms was largely a dime novel invention, written by people who had never spent a season on a cattle drive and sold to audiences who had no reason to question it. The real cowboy was mostly just trying to hold on to a hard job with gear that could be reclaimed the moment the season ended. The horse was not his partner. It was company property with better mythology than the man riding it. 11. Walk onto any Hollywood Western set, and the costume department has one move ready before you even sit down. Wide brim, high crown, Stetson, because without it, you are not a cowboy. You are just a confused man in dusty trousers, standing next to a horse, wondering what went wrong. That hat is the West. It is practically stitched into American identity at this point. Except the men who actually lived that life were mostly wearing something else entirely. The hat that showed up most consistently on real cowboys, lawmen, and outlaws across the frontier was the bowler. Short, rounded, and looking far more at home on a London banker than on anyone who had ever been in a gunfight. Bat Masterson wore one. Butch Cassidy wore one. Hard, practical men chose it for hard, practical reasons. It stayed on in strong winds, it held its shape under rough conditions, and it did the job without making a statement. Early Stetsons did exist on the frontier, but they looked nothing like the cinematic version. Flatter brims, simpler crowns, none of the dramatic silhouette that ended up defining the myth. The iconic cowboy hat look was assembled later, by film studios that needed their heroes identifiable from the back row of a theater. The hat was never chosen by history. It was chosen by a costume department solving a visual problem, and somewhere along the way the solution became the symbol. The West got its hat from Hollywood, not the other way around. Here's the fully rewritten version. 12 Westerns have a very specific relationship with trains. Masked riders appear from nowhere, horses matching speed with a moving locomotive. Someone always ends up on the roof, and the passengers inside are doing that particular kind of panicking that only happens in films. Watch enough of it, and train robbery starts feeling less like a crime and more like a toll, scheduled stop on the frontier timetable. The actual numbers tell a much quieter story. Historical records show fewer than 1,000 attempted or completed train robberies across the entire United States between 1866 and 1910. Spread that across 44 years and a continent, and you are looking at roughly 20 attempts per year nationwide, not just the West. And a significant portion of those failed before anyone got rich. Bank robberies, another Western staple, were even rarer than that. The average frontier traveler could spend years moving through the West and never come within 50 miles of either one. Then came 1903, a 12-minute film called The Great Train Robbery, one of the first narrative movies ever made, hit audiences who had never seen anything like it, and it landed hard. That single short film did more to cement the train robbery as a frontier institution than decades of actual frontier history had managed. Hollywood found one spectacular crime, reproduced it endlessly, and eventually the reproduction became the memory. The West did not run on robbery and chaos. It found one good story, handed it to the film industry, and lost control of it completely. 13 few moments in American history arrived with better branding than the gunfight at the Corral. The name alone does half the work. You hear it and the image assembles itself automatically. A wide open corral, two sides facing each other, across a stretch of dusty gotio ground. Enough dramatic silence before the first shot to fill a cinema. Reality had considerably less room to work with. The actual confrontation on October 26, 1881, took place in a narrow vacant lot near Fly's Photogravity Studio, roughly a few doors down from the corral itself, not inside it, not staged across dramatic open ground, a tight, cramped alley width of space between buildings, with 6 men close enough that missing would have required genuine effort. The whole thing was over in about 30 seconds, no prolonged tension, no cinematic standoff, a sudden, ugly, fine burst of close-range gunfire that left 3 men dead, and the survivors probably too shaken to appreciate that they had just made history. What followed was something arguably more impressive than the fight itself. Over the coming decades, the story got relocated, expanded, and polished into something the original participants would barely recognize. The name did most of the heavy lifting. Call it the gunfight at the OK Corral, and it sounds like destiny. Call it what it actually was, a meter stew, 30-second shootout in a vacant lot near a photography studio, and it sounds like a 2-footnote. History handed the world a messy, chaotic street brawl. The title turned it into an institution. 14 Tombstone carries a reputation so loaded that people barely think of it as a real place anymore. In popular memory, it is less a town and more a permanent state of violence. Everybody armed, everybody dangerous, problems solved exclusively through gunfire and poor impulse control. If any place in the American West was supposed to be the living definition of lawless, Tombstone was the one, which makes the actual history almost funny. Tombstone had a law banning firearms inside town limits. Visitors who rode in carrying weapons were expected to check them at a hotel or a stable before doing anything else. No strolling the streets armed, no exceptions for reputation. The town had rules, and the town expected them followed. The most famous moment in Tombstone's entire history, the gunfight near the OK Corral, happened specifically because a group of men refused to comply with that ordinance, and Wyatt Earp and his brothers walked down to do something about it. The legendary shootout was not a symptom of Tombstone's lawlessness. It was an attempt to enforce the law against people who had decided it did not apply to them. That single confrontation got retold, dramatized, and repeated so many times across so many decades that the rule it was trying to enforce completely disappeared from the story. What remained was the gunfire, stripped of its context, handed to Hollywood, and transformed into the defining image of everything the town was actually trying to prevent. Tombstone spent years trying to become more civilized. History remembered it for the 30 seconds when civilization briefly lost. 15 Getting sick on the frontier was already bad enough. What came next was sometimes worse. When a frontier town needed a doctor, they usually got someone who called themselves one. What that actually meant was an entirely different conversation. Medical licensing was loosely enforced at best and completely non-existent at worst. A man with steady hands, a leather bag, and enough confidence to sound authoritative could set up practice in a new town without anyone asking too many questions, because there was usually nobody qualified to ask them. The barber surgeon was not a myth, it was a genuine tradition that survived well into the frontier era. One person handling shaves, haircuts, tooth extractions, wound treatment, and bone setting, sometimes in the same chair, sometimes with the same tools, sometimes in the same afternoon. The sterilization process between a shave and an open wound could be as thorough as a quick wipe on whatever rag was closest. Infection was not a concern. People had fully connected to the instruments yet. Credentials were whatever you claimed them to be. A steady hand and a high tolerance for other people's pain could substitute for formal training in a town that had no formal alternative. If the patient survived, the man was a healer. If they did not, he was often also the one preparing them for burial, which kept the whole process conveniently contained. The calm, competent frontier doctor, working in a clean room with proper instruments, belongs almost entirely to film. The real version had a razor, limited options, and a confidence that the situation did not always justify. 16. There is something almost appealing about the idea of frontier whiskey. Rough, honest, poured heavy by a bartender who has seen everything. You throw it back, feel it land, and get on with whatever dangerous thing comes next. Hard drink for hard people. No pretense, no garnish, no questions. The honest part is where it starts to fall apart. A significant amount of what got poured into glasses across frontier saloons was not whiskey in any meaningful sense of the word. It was cheap alcohol stretched as far as greed would allow, then doctored to disguise the damage. Turpentine for burn. Ammonia for kick. Tobacco juice, gunpowder, and various other additions that had no business being near a drinking glass all found their way into the mix depending on what the seller had available and how little he respected his customers. The result had a name, Rotgut, and that name was doing considerably more honest work than the man pouring it. The goal was never quality. It was not even really comfort. It was speed and potency. Get the customer drunk before his throat had time to send an accurate report back to his brain. In a world where the drink was sometimes the only relief available after a brutal day of physical labor, men paid for it anyway, asked few questions, and came back tomorrow. The polished saloon of popular imagination was selling atmosphere. The real one was selling the fastest possible exit from a hard life, mixed with whatever happened to be within reach. 17. Ask someone to describe the American West in one image, and there is a decent chance a tumbleweed shows up in the answer. It has become shorthand for an entire era: dust, silence, emptiness, and that brittle little ball of dry plant drifting through the frame like it owns the place. It does not even belong there. The tumbleweed most people picture when they think of the frontier is Russian thistle, a plant with no American roots whatsoever. It arrived in the United States by accident in the 1870s, tucked inside a shipment of contaminated flaxseed imported from Russia. Nobody invited it, nobody planted it. It simply showed up, spread aggressively, and made itself at home in a landscape that had been getting along without it for centuries. The timing alone is worth sitting with. By the 1870s, many of the cattle drives were already well underway. Frontier towns were already built and functioning. The era that people would later romanticize as the Wild West was not at its beginning. It was already moving toward its end. The tumbleweed missed most of the story it would eventually come to represent. What it did not miss was the cameras. When filmmakers began building their version of the West, they discovered that a tumbleweed rolling across an empty street could communicate abandonment, desolation, and silence without a single word of dialogue. It was visually perfect. So they leaned on it repeatedly until audiences stopped questioning whether it belonged and simply accepted it as part of the furniture. An imported weed from Russia showed up late, wandered into the myth, and became one of its most enduring symbols. The frontier never asked for it. Hollywood never let it leave. 18. The cowboy Hollywood built was almost always the same man, white, rugged, weathered in just the right way, riding across open land like the entire frontier had been personally arranged for his arrival. That image repeated itself across so many decades and so many films that it stopped looking like a creative decision and started looking like a historical record. It was neither. It was a choice, and it erased a significant portion of the people who actually built that world. After the Civil War, historians estimate that roughly 1 in 4 working cowboys was black, many of them formerly enslaved men who had walked away from the only life they had ever known and built something entirely new in the open range. They drove the same cattle, worked the same trails, and lived the same brutal conditions as everyone else. The myth just forgot to include them when it decided who the hero looked like. Mexican vaqueros were not background figures in cowboy culture. They were its architects. The roping techniques, the saddle designs, the entire vocabulary that people now treat as authentically American, lasso, rodeo, stampede, ranch, came directly from vaquero tradition. Cowboys did not invent that culture. They inherited it, adopted it, and then watched a granach deal. The story get retold without crediting the source. Native people worked the frontier too, navigated it, survived it, and shaped it in ways the dominant myth spent decades reducing to a single dimension. This was never just a casting problem. It was a deliberate narrowing of who got to count as American, dressed up as entertainment, and repeated until the narrowing felt natural. The frontier was built by everyone. The legend only kept room for one. 19. Nobody roots for the mob. But dress the same mob in a cause, give them a villain worth hating, and suddenly the torches look righteous. That is the vigilante story in its simplest form, and the American West handed it to popular culture in a version so polished that generations watched it and felt nothing but satisfaction. The system failed, good men acted, justice was served. What that version skips is everything that actually happened in between. Vigilance committees were real. In places where formal law was genuinely absent or too corrupt to function, groups of citizens did organize to fill the gap. But the men who showed up to these committees brought everything with them: old grudges, racial prejudice, business disputes, personal vendettas, and a collective certainty that their instincts about guilt were reliable enough to replace a trial. Often the trial lasted minutes. Sometimes evidence was not considered necessary at all. The accused had already been decided before anyone sat down. In 1856, the San Francisco Committee of Vigilance grew to more than 6,000 members. They hanged men. They removed elected officials from office by force. They operated entirely outside the law while remaining absolutely convinced they were its defenders. That gap between what they believed they were doing and what they were actually doing is the part the legend always skips. Because once you look at the process instead of the outcome, the righteous citizens and the lawless mob start using the same methods, answering to the same absence of accountability, and telling themselves the same story about why it was necessary. The difference between justice and revenge has never been the act itself. It has always been who gets to write the ending. At some point in the 1850s, someone in the U.S. Army looked at the American Southwest, saw heat, sand, and distance, and had a thought so confident it almost sounds fake. Maybe what this place really needed was camels, not better supply lines, not better roads, camels, and they actually went through with it. The Army imported them, tested them, and tried to treat the whole thing like frontier innovation instead of a bureaucratic fever dream. On paper, the logic looked clean enough. Camels handled deserts, the Southwest had deserts, problem solved. In practice, the animals terrified horses and mules. Soldiers barely knew how to manage them, and the terrain was rougher and rockier than the fantasy had promised. Instead of becoming the future of military transport, the experiment turned into a bizarre, expensive lesson in what happens when a map starts making decisions. That is what makes the story perfect. It was not a joke, it was policy. Real people signed papers, moved money, and committed to the idea that the frontier might be won by imported camels. The Wild West did not just produce legends, it occasionally produced government-funded hallucinations. At some point, the cowboy stopped being a working man and became something else entirely. A figure permanently coiled for violence, revolver riding low on the hip, every step carrying the quiet suggestion that things could go sideways at any moment. Popular culture loved that version so much it stopped questioning whether it made any practical sense. It did not. Most cowboys were hired agricultural laborers. Their days were built around cattle, weather, broken equipment, physical exhaustion, and the particular misery of doing hard outdoor work in conditions that rarely cooperated. A handgun was expensive to own, heavy to carry, through a full day of physical work, and genuinely not that useful when your actual job involved roping, branding, and keeping livestock moving in the right direction. On many ranches, it was more of an inconvenience than a tool. When firearms actually mattered on the frontier, rifles and shotguns were typically the practical choice. Some ranches and towns actively discouraged or outright restricted pistols because accidents and avoidable confrontations cost everyone something. The six-shooter became the symbol it is for one reason that had nothing to do with history. It looked extraordinary on screen. A coil of rope on a saddle horn was historically accurate and completely invisible as a character detail. A revolver on a hip told an audience everything they needed to know about a man in a single frame. Hollywood made a visual decision and then repeated it until the decision became the accepted truth. The real cowboy was not armed for drama, he was armed, occasionally, for specific practical reasons that the camera never found interesting enough to linger on. 22 Billy the Kid. Even the name was designed to land a certain way. Young, reckless, and supposedly deadly beyond his years, the boy who killed one man for every year of his short life. 21 victims before 21 years old. That number gets repeated with the confidence of settled history, as though someone sat down with the records, counted carefully, and closed the file. Nobody ever closed the file. Historians who have actually gone back through the documentation do not arrive anywhere near that figure with any real confidence. The true number was almost certainly lower, and several of the deaths most commonly attributed to Billy came out of chaotic group confrontations, where determining whose bullet did what is less historical forensics and more educated guessing dressed up as fact. The bodies were real. The clean accounting was not. But 21 survived anyway, because it was too perfect to let go. Balanced, poetic, and multiple to forget. 1 kill per year of life. It sounds less like a body count and more like a structure someone built deliberately, the kind of detail that sticks because it satisfies something in the listener rather than because it holds up under scrutiny. That is exactly how frontier legends expanded, not by uncovering more evidence, but by finding numbers and details that sounded inevitable. Billy the Kid did not need 21 kills to become one of the most recognized names in American history. He just needed a number dramatic enough to keep pulling the trigger long after he was gone. 30 million animals do not disappear quietly. But the story of how the American buffalo nearly vanished has been told quietly for a long time, softened, spread across vague causes, occasionally blamed on the very people who had lived alongside the herds for thousands of years without destroying them. The real story is far more deliberate than that. Native peoples hunted bison across the Great Plains for millennia. The herds survived it. They survived it because the hunting was sustainable, managed by necessity, and embedded in a way of life that depended on the animal continuing to exist. The herds were not in decline. They were, by most accounts, enormous. Then the commercial hunters arrived. Between the 1860s and 1880s, professional market hunters moved across the plains in industrial numbers, killing an estimated 30 million bison in roughly 2 decades. The target was not the whole animal, it was the hide and the tongue, the parts with commercial value. Everything else was left where it fell. Photographs from the period show plains literally carpeted in rotting carcasses, bones stretching to the horizon, the scale of it almost impossible to process. The United States government was not a passive bystander. Military commanders actively encouraged the slaughter, and the reasoning was explicit. A plains tribe without buffalo had no food, no material for shelter, no foundation for independence. Destroy the herds and you destroyed the people's ability to resist removal and confinement. The buffalo were not hunted to extinction by the communities that depended on them. They were systematically eliminated to destroy those communities from the outside in. 24 John Wayne stood 6'4" and cast a shadow that could fill a doorframe on its own. Hollywood understood exactly what that did to an audience and spent decades finding men built the same way. Broad, heavy, physically commanding, the kind of presence that made every scene feel like a confrontation waiting to happen. That image attached itself to the cowboy myth so completely that people stopped questioning whether the real men looked anything like it. They did not come close. The average working cowboy stood around 5 feet 5 inches tall and weighed somewhere between 120 and 150 pounds. Closer in build to a modern jockey than a movie star, and not by accident. The work selected for that body type, deliberately. Long days in the saddle on compact, agile horses demanded balance, endurance, and the ability to move efficiently, not raw size or brute strength. A heavier man wore out horses faster, moved less nimbly, and could become a genuine liability on a long cattle drive. Ranch owners hiring hands understood that. They were running a business, not a casting call. Hollywood made a different calculation entirely. A 5'5" hero does not project authority from the back row of a theater. A 6'4" man with a wide brim and a slow walk does. So the industry built its own version of the cowboy, scaled up for the screen, and repeated it until the screen version replaced the real one in public memory. The frontier built the kind of man the work actually required. The legend built the kind of man the camera preferred. 25. Everyone loves the moment the good people finally snap. The system failed, the villain walks free, and a group of ordinary men decide they have had enough of waiting for justice that is never coming. They ride out together, find the guilty party, and handle it themselves. No courtrooms, no delays, no technicalities, just results. Westerns sold that moment as the purest form of frontier heroism, and audiences bought it every single time. The problem is what that story looks like from the inside. Vigilance committees did form across the frontier, and in places where law enforcement was genuinely absent, some of them served a real purpose. But the men who showed up to these meetings did not leave their personal history at the door. They brought grudges that had nothing to do with justice. They brought racial bias, old debts, business rivalries, and a shared certainty that their gut feelings about guilt were reliable enough to replace actual evidence. Trials lasted minutes when they happened at all. The accused rarely had anyone arguing their side. In 1856, the San Francisco Committee of Vigilance expanded to over 6,000 members. They hanged men. They forced elected officials out of office. They operated with complete confidence in their own righteousness and zero accountability to anyone outside their own ranks. That is the detail the heroic version always quietly removes. The process these committees used was functionally identical to the lawlessness they claimed to be correcting. The only real difference was that one side had a cause they believed in deeply enough to stop questioning it. Belief in your own righteousness has never been the same thing as actually being right, and justice handed out by a mob has always looked cleaner in the retelling than it did on the ground. 26. A lone rider crosses open land, coat snapping in the wind, carrying the whole era on saddle. It is such a powerful image that people start to believe the frontier itself ran on hooves and nothing else. That was never the whole system. Horses mattered, especially for ranch work, patrols, and short-distance travel, but by the late 1800s, the railroad was doing the heavy lifting that actually transformed the West. People, freight, livestock, mail, and commerce moved across long distances by train because trains were faster, heavier, and far more important to the region's expansion than one romantic rider framed against the horizon. And before many people even had personal horses, stagecoaches were already carrying passengers and mail along routes that tied scattered settlements together. That is the part the myth quietly trims away. A railroad makes history. A horse makes a poster. The West did not move on horseback by itself. It ran on tracks, schedules, and systems far less cinematic than a sunset silhouette. 27. Picture yourself riding into a dusty frontier town after a long week on the trail. Hungry, enough to trust a menu you probably should not trust. Then you spot something promising. Prairie oysters. It sounds respectable, almost fancy, like some rare delicacy hauled in from somewhere wet and civilized. You order them, already, imagining seafood in the middle of cattle country, which should have been your first warning. What arrives at the table ends that fantasy immediately. Prairie oysters were deep-fried bull testicles, usually fresh from castration season on nearby ranches. Not shellfish, not seafood, not even remotely related to an oyster, unless the cook was also a poet and a liar. During branding season, ranches had plenty of one particular byproduct, and someone decided the best use for it was to bread it, fry it, and give it a name that revealed absolutely nothing. That is what makes the dish feel so perfectly Western. The food was practical. The label was the ambush. The West did not just improvise meals, it occasionally turned dinner into a trap. The real West was messier, stranger, and far more interesting than anything Hollywood sold. You, drop a comment below. Which one did you grow up believing without ever questioning? If this changed how you see the frontier, hit like and subscribe because we are not done yet.